On Upfront today, it's the biggest story in the world. As the coronavirus pandemic keeps spreading, how is it that South Korea seems to have controlled it? And why is the United States so far behind? I'll ask a top scientist in Seoul and a top Republican in the US. South Korea has more than 8,000 cases of the coronavirus, but so far, remarkably, they've managed to avoid the staggering death tolls we've seen elsewhere in the world from COVID-19, the disease caused by the virus. How did they do it, and should other countries follow their lead? Joining me now to discuss this is Dr. Jerome Kim, a leading American physician and research scientist based in the South Korean capital of Seoul, where he's Director General of the International Vaccine Institute. Jerome Kim, thank you for joining me on Upfront. As the coronavirus throws the entire world into unprecedented chaos, South Korea has been hailed as a success story, as a model even for the rest of the world. Is that a fair description in your view?
So I think that every country will have its own approach. You know, the Chinese exerted pretty draconian government control over movement of people, but then did the same thing that the Koreans are doing. They practiced social distancing. They aggressively pursued a test, treat, isolate, and policy. They tracked people down if they could find them. They closed schools, and all of these things are things that the Koreans did. The Korean government never shut down restaurants, for instance, and that, you know, I think is kind of interesting. It's never walled off a city. And again, when the Koreans heard that they should stay at home and practice social distancing, people by and large did. So
what specifically is it that South Korea has done that has helped keep the death toll much lower than other countries in similar positions?
So one of the things is that they opened up testing centers that people could drive in and go through. They made it all free. And, you know, once they identified people, they put them into quarantine. And that ability to identify people who might be infected, to isolate them, was probably very important and more difficult to do in settings like in Italy, where it looks like there was a lot more spread that was not noticed, or in the United States, for instance, in the nursing home in Seattle, where you had to see a lot of deaths before you realized that there was actually something going on in the community.
You mentioned the importance of testing in South Korea. You mentioned the United States, where you're from. How is it that South Korea was able to, or has been testing something like 20,000 people per day? I think there's been 5,000 tests per million people in a country of just over 50 million people. In the US, it's 100 tests per million up until very recently. Why is it that South Korea, a country that doesn't have the wealth, or many would argue the technology of the United States of America, has been able to get tests out of the door so quickly, working tests, drive-throughs, and the US and other countries haven't been able to do that? Why?
So I think part of it is preparedness, right? The other thing is that South Korea's biotechnology industry is very robust. It's very active. There are lots of companies, small companies, that are often spin-offs of universities, where the people who are in charge are scientists. And they found, you know, the Chinese published the sequence of the coronavirus. These companies looked at it, and they rapidly developed tests. But the difference between a university lab and a company is that the company can manufacture things. And the government was then prepared to examine those kits and approve them if they were good kits. The same way that for vaccine development, you know, CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness, had identified organizations that could respond quickly with vaccine development. So again, this is a part of knowing what's there and having people who understand how to develop kits. I mean, these molecular diagnostics are pretty sensitive and specific if you know what you're doing.
Realistically, you mentioned vaccines. How soon is it going to be? How soon is it going to be until we see an actual working, effective vaccine? Obviously, there's a lot of red tape involved, rightly involved in testing a vaccine before you put it out to the general public. But online right now, you see a lot of people making all sorts of claims about how near or far we are away from a vaccine. You run the International Vaccine Institute. What kind of timeline are we talking about?
So Anthony Fauci, who's very well known and very well respected, said, we will know the answer of whether the vaccine works in 12 months. And depending on how the approvals process goes through the US FDA or through other regulatory agencies, then with expedited review of the data on both whether the vaccine works and, very importantly, if the vaccine is safe, approval could come within weeks. And assuming that the company has been scaling up manufacture during the time when the final tests were done, then a vaccine could come online very shortly after the approval. Most companies, like the big companies, when they're doing a vaccine or in the final phase of testing, are already developing the manufacturing facilities in order to have the vaccine once it's approved. So, with CEPI, it'll be a little different because CEPI is not a big company. It's a collaboration.
You're saying 12 months to get it, check it works, and then a few weeks after that to get the approvals?
12 months to see that it works. Then, say several weeks to months to get the regulatory approvals. And assuming that the company has been scaling up manufacturing, then you could have vaccine, theoretically, I don't know, it's hard to say, 1 to 6 months later.
So a year to 18 months is obviously still a very long time for people who are suffering from the illness. A lot more people are going to die in that time period. Let's talk about some of the measures that are being taken to try and contain the number of deaths. South Korea, you mentioned China took some draconian steps. South Korea has taken some extreme measures too that some people might say is a kind of, in a normal world is a violation of civil liberties or people's privacy. Since the outbreak, the country's been monitoring the movements of those people who've tested positive. They've been using information obtained from cell phone records, credit card receipts, other private data to let the general public know where people have been, where there have been outbreaks, down to, I think, which seats people have sat in movie theaters. Is that the kind of sacrifices that a free society has to make in order to fight this pandemic?
So I think every country will have a different balance of the need for privacy and the need for public safety. And we do this all the time, right? I mean, in this case, you have the health of a nation or the health of a city, and you have individual rights. And so, I think a lot of people don't mind because, they want to know where they might potentially have been exposed, particularly if they develop symptoms. The other very important thing is it helps the government to rapidly identify the outbreaks. And if controlling the virus, limiting its spread is felt by the government to be an overarching priority, you have to have laws in place that very carefully explain what the balance of privacy versus public safety is. And the Korean government actually had done that.
As successful as South Korea has been in responding to this pandemic, we're also now seeing reports of new clusters of infections, including 129 that were linked to a call center in Seoul, a region that's home to 23 million people. Is the country prepared? You're there on the ground. Is South Korea equipped to wage a long-term war against COVID-19? Because this is not going away anytime soon, is it? The danger is complacency, thinking you've beaten it when you haven't.
Right. And I think the thing that a lot of people have been emphasizing is that they may have won the first battle, but this is a war. And like a war, winning the first battle is important, but it's not the only thing. And really what the government's ultimate aim might be is to restore normality to life, the return to normalcy. And the only way to really achieve that is to use a vaccine. You'll have to be able to ensure that as people carry on their activities of daily living, that they're going to be protected.
One last question before we finish. You're an American citizen. You were born and raised in the US. You're now working in Seoul. As an infectious disease specialist in a country that's had more cases of COVID-19 than any other country in East Asia bar China, where would you rather be right now? Where would you feel safer, South Korea or back here in the US?
So actually, for me and for my family, I don't think it matters. We would follow as much as we could the policy of social distancing. We would follow good hand hygiene. We would protect ourselves and protect others. And I would counsel other people to do the same.
But it must make a difference.
Actually has also
but it must make a difference to be living and working in a country where the government takes it seriously, as opposed to a country like the US, where some of your friends, former colleagues, Dr. Anthony Fauci and others, are having to work under a president who, until a few weeks ago, was calling this a hoax.
Yeah, I think Dr. Fauci, Dr. Birx, Dr. Redfield, and I've actually worked for all of them, really are a good team. They know what they're doing. They're competent. They're directed. They will start issuing the kind of clear messaging that you need. I mean, as a country, you have to be decisive. Messages have to be clear, and there has to be an integrated response. And the United States actually was considered by many to be better prepared for this than many countries. They're a little bit behind the 8 ball now, but I think that with the right team in place, that they'll catch up.
Dr. Jerome Kim, thank you for joining me on Upfront.